Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Мы начали работу в прямом
Hello,
эфире.
colleagues. We are now live. My name is Igor Pavlovsky. I am director of ORA, Arctic Development Project Office. We are having another roundtable discussion. Unfortunately, we can only do so online, but unfortunately, we didn't have any other options. This event is organized jointly with the Gorchakov Foundation. We are very grateful to the Gorchakov Foundation, and this is part of Russia's presidency in the Arctic Council. We've had a number of discussions, and we all agree that we need to continue dialogue despite the current difficulties, because the Arctic is a very complex part of the world, and it's always better to have dialogue. So anyway, I welcome all of our participants today. Today we'll talk about security issues, and we decided we are going to define security in a broad sense, because normally people think about military affairs first and foremost, but we would like to cover industrial security, transport security, environmental security, and other matters as well. Now I will give the floor to Ekaterina Serova, our moderator. Ekaterina. Thank you very much, Igor. I'm happy to welcome all of our participants. My name is Ekaterina Serova. I work at the Arctic Center of Petrozavodsk University. It's a great honor for me to be the moderator of this event. Today, we'll talk about some very important matters which affect many countries in Eurasia and across the Atlantic. We'll talk about security today, hard security, military components of security, and soft security as well. Soft security includes human security, environmental security aspects, and sustainability. We will also talk about educational cooperation and scientific cooperation in the Arctic. Our speakers will have 15 minutes each, 15 minutes per person. After that, you will be able to send in your questions via chat. This is the fourth session in this series of our discussions. And we have experts from Finland, the United States, and Russia. Our first expert is professor of international relations at the Far Eastern Federal University, Russian International Affairs Council expert, Andrey Gubin. Andrey, are you here? Yes, I'm here. Good to see you. It's midnight where I am. I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation, and thank you for making me the first speaker today. Of course, I will try to stay awake for as long as I can and listen to all the other speakers as well. Like Igor Pavlovsky said earlier, the Arctic is a very complicated part of the world, and it's not as simple as some other regions. It's not linear. You can't measure everything in the terms of military security, which is what I'm going to focus on primarily. I will talk about Russia's security situation in its military dimension, considering the current turbulent situation. For every state, survivability is a key concept. By survivability, I mean its economy being able to continue operation despite major pressure, in some cases blockade, lack of investment, unfair competition, sanctions, etc., etc. every nation faced with a situation like that would have to fully mobilize and use all of its resources. The political system of the state has to be able to organize life within the country properly and protect society against various threats and challenges. 1/3 of Russia's territory is in the Arctic. So it is perfectly logical that President Putin has decided that the next decade Russia will focus primarily on the Arctic, developing the Arctic, developing it for economic purposes, and also strengthening Russia's security in the Arctic. Why is the Arctic so important to us, this Arctic 1/3 of Russia? I can tell you that the Arctic provides at least 10% of Russia's GDP. Estimates vary, but at least it's not less than 10. Some even say 20% of Russia's GDP comes from the Arctic territories. 20% of Russian exports originate in the Arctic and subarctic territories. It accounts for 80% of Russia's natural gas. Russia's continental shelf is our strategic reserves, which has enough deposits for hundreds of years. Of course, if we are careful and we develop these fields in a sustainable manner, if we use green technologies, then there is the Northern Sea route. Despite all the difficulties, all the controversies, all the challenges, for example, recently this subject was raised at the Eastern Economic Forum. Still, in 2021, 33.5 thousand tons of cargo has been moved along the Northern Sea route, and there are plans to bring up this number to 80 million tons. Then it will be 100 million tons. And of course, you cannot achieve this but just in increasing the number of ships. It's a complicated project. You need to develop the onshore infrastructure as well. And of course, considering that this sea route is in the Arctic, we will also have to invest in security. And I'm not just talking about icebreakers. I'm not just talking about climatic issues. Even physical safety of cargo and ships will have to be secured. Militarily, Russia's presence in the Arctic is due to the fact that there are some strategic military installations here, both nuclear and conventional, to thwart potential aggression from other countries and to ensure global stability. Just as an illustration of how important the Arctic is to Russia militarily, the Arctic fleet has been elevated to the status of a separate command. It's a separate military district now. And it is to ensure security from Murmansk to another. You know, my students, when I talk to them about the space from Murmansk to another, they Googled it and they told me it's only 5 hours if you go in a straight line, but that's if you fly. If you go along the coast, that's much, much longer route. Russia's Arctic forces include the so-called Arctic Brigade, Infantry Brigade, In the future, there are plans to expand this brigade and provide it with new weapons developed specifically for Arctic conditions. And these models of weapons are currently being tested. Some of them have been designed already. Then there is the Air Force Army, the Air Defense Command, for obvious reasons, because the Arctic sector is the most likely sector where we may face an attack by potential enemies, strategic forces. Strategic bombers will probably come from the Arctic. We have several bases. There is Wrangel Island, Franz Joseph Land, and Novosibirsky Archipelago, mainly 3 key bases. And Russia plans to deploy troops in all 3 key areas to make sure the Arctic is properly protected. Like I said, we're talking about the territory from Murmansk to Anadырь. So what does security in this region entail? Actually, it's a very broad subject. If we go back to the security concept of 1935, it mentions being able to transport strategic raw materials and operate transport corridors in the Arctic. Of course, this is extremely important for Russia's economy. However, the security of transport corridors and supplying strategic raw materials, this has to be ensured through military means. Of course, Russia does not want other countries to be able to interdict, to interfere. There is the Western concept of anti-access area denial. In Russian, it's slightly different. So, what is important to the Russian leadership is to maintain the strategic strike capabilities. In other words, the Arctic is an important bridgehead for Russia, and challenging climatic conditions in the Arctic are actually in our favor, because it would be very difficult for our foes to operate against our forces under such conditions. Also, it is important to develop air defense and missile defense in this region. Last year, Russia carried out a test of a missile defense system in the Arctic, and also the Arctic fleet should be able to work together with the Baltic fleet in the west and with the Pacific fleet in the east, which means military ships and submarines should be able to operate and go from the western tip to the eastern sector freely. And we face real threats and challenges in the Arctic. Some of them are already present, and there are others that are hypothetical and may emerge further down the line. One of the problems in the Arctic is that infrastructure is underdeveloped for obvious reasons. There are objective factors that hold us back. And even here where I am in the Far East, we feel this lack of energy, lack of materials, lack of ships, lack of infrastructure. We're not able to carry out search and rescue operations around the year. All this makes it difficult to maintain military and civilian installations in the Arctic. Of course, Russia is working on these matters, but not everything is up to us. There are climatic changes happening as well. Like I said, the Arctic is a highly unusual region. Estimates vary, but basically experts say if ice continues to melt at the same pace, by 2045, navigation in the Arctic will be possible even without icebreakers. And of course, this will be a game changer. This will change the situation in the Arctic dramatically because, of course, there will be much more commercial navigation. This would be great for commercial ships. They no longer need icebreakers. It will be easier for scientists to conduct their research, but it will also be easier for various militaries to send their military ships there. If they can do so without icebreakers, military activities by other countries will increase in the Arctic, something that Russia certainly will not enjoy. By the way, one of the few matters where 99% of all the countries agree is that the Arctic is the area of global responsibility. And at the same time, I would say it is rather strange to see Russia's special status in the Arctic being denied or Russia's claims to the continental shelf being rejected. Of course, we shouldn't expect to see anything else given current confrontation, but let's just hope that times of cooperation come back in the future. Of course, the situation in the Arctic Council is pretty complex right now, specifically because some of the matters that should be discussed in the Arctic Council are being discussed by the United States, Canada, and European countries in some other formats where Moscow is not invited and which Moscow is not part of. This is another negative trend, which I hope we are able to overcome at some point. Of course, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the situation becomes more alarming because NATO installations, including strike capabilities, may be deployed in Sweden and Finland, and this will not make the Arctic any safer. The Russian leadership has identified its priorities in the Arctic. As far as legal matters are concerned, for example, Russia emphasizes the need to get international recognition for the borders of Russia's continental shelf. Like I mentioned earlier, Russia's claims are largely ignored, and I don't think that we will see much progress in this matter anytime soon, given the current situation. I don't think Russia will gain international recognition for its continental shelf claims within the next few years. Still, Russia is interested in developing infrastructure, developing Arctic territories, providing its troops in the Arctic with appropriate weapons. Also, man-made disasters, emergencies is another important matter. So prevention of such disasters is also a key priority to Russia. We should also be aware of international terrorism. This challenge, this problem can also come to the Arctic. Non-state actors may be able to stage terrorist attacks against tankers. Such a possibility does exist, and Russia is aware of it. What does Russia do to address these challenges? First, there is a comprehensive plan to develop port infrastructure in the Arctic. I should probably mention the Arkhangelsk port project. There are some obvious difficulties. There is shortage of resources. Let's be frank about it. And there are difficulties attracting international investors, given the current situation. There are some Chinese investors who are somewhat interested, but I don't think that China is going to invest in Arkhangelsk heavily anytime soon.
Russia has an extensive experience of using and operating icebreakers, and new icebreakers are being built, called Arctic and Sever. One built at the Sever Wharf, and there would be some auxiliary vessels being built, and gas fuel is being used. Russia implements its interests in the Arctic, and it is associated with major difficulties, including not just because it is full of hot factors and quite sensitive, if I may put that, but the behavior of other stakeholders, such as the countries of the Arctic zone and the members of the Arctic Council and non-Arctic countries, is not predictable, and there are many options as how they may behave. At the moment, once the investment cooperation with the Global West has stopped, the key transport and energy infrastructure projects in the Arctic have been frozen, some of them would be adjusted, and today the main focus would be made on interaction with our Asian partners such as India, Middle East, China, Southeast Asia, and for instance, speaking at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, the MPs and speakers raised that question, as they did that over the last 8 years. But still, there are more undiscussed questions than discussed ones. Technological, technical, logistics, cooperation, providing for the flawless operation of the Northern Sea Route, implementation of the gas projects, and production of natural resources there. There is a question whether we have to produce iron ore there, or we have to wait a little bit or to provide some lean technologies. Actually, these discussions are going on. Not all the initiatives can be implemented in a rapid manner. Nevertheless, we have to bear in mind that in order to restore the multi-dimensional cooperation such as the Barents Sea cooperation, Northern Dimension, and other ones would require years and efforts. At the moment, it is very difficult to say whether we would be capable of resolving something in the framework of these multilateral formats. Certainly, Russia is doing a lot bilaterally. But there are difficulties there as well. For instance, we cannot rule out that cross-border for Lomonosov Crest would intensify. Canada also raises its claims in the Sea of Barents. For instance, we have an agreement with Norway signed back in 2010, and sometimes Norway disagrees with that and makes attempts to revisit it. There are some differences related to demarcation of the Alaska sea bottom with the United States, and probably the sea bottom next to Alaska is not the most acute problem, but still it would be included into the agenda eventually. There are lots of hotbeds along the borders of Russia, including the Arctic region. Unfortunately, is the model that the NATO member states are following. Therefore, we have to expect further attempts by the West to prevent Russia from using some of the Arctic potential. And at the same time, we have to expect that Russia would do its best to freely use the Arctic potential in any sense, in the economic and the social, in the natural one, and certainly in geopolitical and military one. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention, dear colleagues. I'll be glad to take any questions. Andrew, thank you so much for this, your presentation, which in every detail highlighted the main elements of the military strategy of Russia, deployment of its armed forces in the Arctic region. You highlighted also the Russia's port infrastructure. Let me also add that the Arctic as a geographic region has always been within the strategic interests of the USSR and the United States even before the Cold War. And it was due to the potential research and survey of the ice shield and flows and streams in order to identify potential climate changes and the geopolitical changes that may emanate from that. Once we speak about soft security and hard security, the Arctic actually manifests that better than any other region. Saying that, I'd like to pass the floor to Robert English, Associate Professor from the University of South California. In his report, we expect you to speak about the future of cooperation in the Arctic region between Russia and the United States. What do you think about the development of the Arctic region? Over to you. Robert, you are inaudible. Apologize. Good morning. Good morning from California. Despite the fact that I can understand Russian, I think it would be better for me to speak English. I was told that there would be an interpretation. I will try to speak clearly. I will read it out very slowly, giving the interpreters an opportunity to translate it. I do think that it would be much easier for them. The topic of my presentation is a little bit different. This is not about the development of the Arctic region, but rather the American and Western policy regarding the Arctic region in the light of the Ukrainian events, and it would be totally different. Let me shift to English and tell me if we need any breaks, or will it be simultaneous or consecutive? Okay? But I will speak in English.
The topic is U.S. or American Arctic policy in the shadow of Ukraine. And my subject concerns the impact of the war in Ukraine on Arctic policy in the United States. And my main point is a simple and discouraging one. The war has seriously distorted debates about the Arctic in the United States and has given a big impetus, a big boost to a military buildup, to the militarization of the Arctic. It's very discouraging news. People who criticize such militarization, such as myself, are now on the defensive side in debates about Arctic
в
policy.
рамках этой дискуссии
The
относительно
person who
арктической
warns that the
политики и
Arctic is
стратегии.
not
Люди,
Ukraine,
которые говорят, что
or that we
Арктика это
need
совсем
to
не Украина,
preserve scientific
и
cooperation
которые
with
настаивают на
Russia
том,
in
что
the Arctic,
необходимо сохранить научное
or
сотрудничество с
that we should
Россией в
be
Арктике,
careful about
или
entering an
что
arms
нам
race
нужно
or some
очень осторожно
spiral of
подходить, иначе мы
confrontation in the
можем
Arctic.
закрутить эту спираль
That
конфронтации в
person
Арктике
will
или
very
разжечь
likely
гонку
be
вооружений.
criticized
Подобный человек
today
почти
as
наверняка
foolish
подвергнется
or simply
критике,
blind.
и его назовут
Everything
слепым или
Russia
глупцом.
does in the region
Все,
is
что
now
делает
presumed
Россия в
to be
регионе, теперь
malevolent.
считается
Everything
зловещим
Russian is now
или
tainted or even
злокозненным.
taboo.
И даже
Concern
пускай
about the
произнести слово
Arctic
«Россия» это
environment
уже
at the
табу. То, что
very moment when that
касается
environment
обстановки
is
в
spiraling into
Арктике.
crisis
И мы сейчас знаем,
and
что
needs the
экология
full
в Арктике
cooperation of all Arctic states.
разрушается, и это
That is
требует
now
усилий
pushed
со
to the
стороны всех
side
арктических
because it is
государств. Теперь
perceived
это
that standing up
отодвинуто,
to Russia
скажем
everywhere
так, на
is more
самые
important.
дальние моменты
We
нашей
see
повестки.
these attitudes
Мы
in two main areas.
рассматриваем подобные подходы в
One
двух
is in
основных
general foreign
направлениях. Первое
policy debates,
– это
particularly in the
дебаты об
elite
общей внешней
media,
политике. В
such as the
основном
New
в
York
СМИ,
Times
которые представляют элиту,
or
например,
Foreign
такие как
Policy
New York
Magazine.
Times или журнал
And
Foreign
the
Policy
second
Magazine.
arena
И вторая арена,
is
где
in
развернуть подобные
Washington
дебаты,
specialized
это
foreign policy making circles, in
специализированные
congressional debates and
политические
think tank
круги в Вашингтоне. Это,
analysis.
например, какие-то аналитические центры или
A third
даже
area is our
Конгресс
community of
США.
Arctic specialists,
Также
of scientific
существует и
and environmental
сообщество
researchers.
ученых,
And here there is
экологов,
deep
которые изучают
concern
Арктику.
about what is
И
being
здесь мы
lost
глубоко
and how
озабочены относительно того, что мы
cooperation
можем
is now
потерять.
being
И
interrupted
что
when we need it
сотрудничество
the
теперь
most.
прерывается сейчас, когда оно
Some of us,
необходимо как никогда.
we find this
Некоторые из
sharp
нас,
anti-Russian turn
в
in the
общем-то, мы
discourse over the Arctic
считаем,
very
что вот эти
discouraging because we
антироссийские
have worked
настроения
hard
в дискурсе
and long
относительно
to
Арктики, они
counter
обескураживающие, потому что мы так
anti-Russian
долго работали
prejudices.
для
Over
того,
the
чтобы
last
бороться с
decade
этими
or even
антироссийскими
more,
стереотипами последние десятилетия, даже
there
дольше.
was a burst
И я могу
of
сказать,
anti-Russian discourse on
что
the
сейчас
Arctic
происходит
over a
всплеск
decade ago
антироссийского
when two
дискурса
events coincided.
в Арктике несколько
One was the
десятилетий назад.
rapid acceleration in the
И
loss of
это
Arctic sea
совпало
ice,
с
and the second was the
быстрым
planting of a
таянием
Russian
арктического
flag
льда,
on the seabed
и также
under the
это
North Pole.
совпало с
These
тем, что
events
Россия установила
sparked
свой
a
флаг
surge in
под
alarmism on
шапкой
several
льда
fronts.
на Северном
One was
полюсе.
that there would now be a new
И
gold rush, a
многие
scramble
говорят, что
for
сейчас
resources,
будет новая золотая лихорадка в
and that
Арктике,
the
поиск
opening of the
новых
Arctic
полезных
would
ископаемых.
cause
И
fierce
открытие
competition
Арктики приведет
that could
к
turn
ожесточенной
deadly,
конкуренции, которая
and
может
that
закончиться
everybody would
плачевными
be
результатами.
scrambling to
И
stake
каждый
claims, to grab
будет
territory, and to
стараться
build
захватить
fleets of
территории
armed icebreakers.
и будут создавать боевые
And this led to the
ледоколы.
second alarmist
И
current,
это привело
namely
к
that
следующему
Russia was
алармистскому
far ahead in this competition,
армейской тенденции, что
and
Россия
that the
может
United
выиграть в этой
States and
конкуренции.
other
И
Arctic
США,
states
и другие арктические
had
государства
better catch up fast.
должны
And
постараться
here we saw
нарастить
an
свое
entire
присутствие и
literature,
догнать Россию.
from scholarly
Было
books
опубликовано
to
большой
think tank
спектр литературы.
analysis
Это и
to
аналитические заметки
newspapers
различных
and
центров,
journals,
это и журналы,
all
это
that
и газеты,
described, all of them
это
together
какие-то и
describing
книги, и
a
научные
growing
публикации,
arms race,
которые
a
все говорили о
military
наращивании
balance that had Russia
гонки
far ahead of the
вооружений,
West.
о том, что в
Most
этой
of
гонке
these
Россия
were
опережает
greatly
Запад на
exaggerated,
несколько голов.
if
И
not
нужно
grossly
сказать, что все
distorted.
это
And
или
there were a
искажает
minority of specialists,
действительность, или,
myself
скажем так,
included, who worked
преувеличивает.
to counter
Существует
such
меньшинство
exaggerations
ученых,
and
например,
offer
таких как я,
a
которые
more
борются с
balanced assessment.
подобными стереотипами, или, по крайней
And
мере,
this
для того, чтобы
included
представление
recognition
действительности было
of the
более
West's
сбалансированным.
own
И это относится к
considerable military
признанию
capabilities in the Arctic
военного
and
потенциала
recognition
Запада в
of
Арктике.
Russia's vulnerabilities
Касается также
and Russia's
признания, что у России
legitimate
также есть своя
security
собственная
concerns in the
уязвимость и
Arctic.
также есть собственные обеспокоенности в области
In
безопасности в Арктике.
2014,
В
when conflict
2014
flared
году,
in
когда
Ukraine
разгорелся
and
конфликт
the
на
Crimea was
юго-востоке
annexed,
Украины,
the
когда
dominant
произошло
portrayal in our
воссоединение
media
Крыма с Россией,
of Russia in the
лидирующей
Arctic
темой наших СМИ
was
относительно России
aggressive
в Арктике
and malevolent. Environmental concerns were definitely secondary, as we saw reflected in both news media and specialized debates. But by 2020, as shock over Crimea had passed and more careful and unemotional attention was paid to the Arctic, this narrative of looming conflict had faded, and both the news media and specialized journals showed much better informed and more expert coverage, with much less hysterical and a much more balanced look at Arctic security, at the relative military capabilities. And it also paid more detailed and sophisticated attention to the growing environmental dangers. This was a time when all kinds of voices became more prominent. We saw debates in the United States Naval Institute that recalled Cold War experience in the Arctic and argued against some of the more simplistic scenarios of huge naval buildups and confrontation with Russia. Some respected military and diplomatic veterans cautioned against exaggeration of the Russian threat and called for more, not less, diplomacy. You even found some US government analysts openly publishing views that criticized shifting resources from China and the Pacific to Russia and the Arctic, or that openly criticized new policies such as conducting aggressive freedom of navigation operations in the Russian Arctic. Even the elite journal Foreign Affairs changed its balance. After publishing many articles that exaggerated the threat of an armed struggle for Arctic resources, or inflating the Russian threat, and even calling for a huge fleet of American armed nuclear icebreakers. Now in 2020, Foreign Affairs published in that same year 2 important articles arguing against threat inflation and for increased diplomatic and especially environmental cooperation. One of those articles was mine, but that's not the only reason I am emphasizing this. Foreign Affairs is the global policy journal of America's Washington elite. Now, just after a few months, it's as if we are back in 2014, only even worse. And the dynamic is the same as 2014, only stronger. Then it was Crimea, now it is Donbass and the wider war that have dramatically shifted the discourse back to an extreme anti-Russian position. And the spillover effect, that if Russia is seen as aggressive in one region, then it must have aggressive intentions in all regions, and so it must be forcefully countered. That is also stronger than ever. We see it in elite media like the New York Times, where articles on militarization of the Arctic are once again as exaggerated and as emotional and as lacking balanced analysis as they were 10 years ago. We see it in think tank debates, where once again, any efforts to see the Arctic through Russian eyes are naive at best, or they threaten America's security at worst. The war in Ukraine has become the automatic, I told you so, trump card, right, kozir, in any discussion about avoiding overreaction. And it's a way to discredit those of us who argue for caution or restraint. We see it now in congressional debates about building new Arctic bases, about building up more Arctic naval forces, and shifting our most advanced air forces towards the Arctic as well. We also see it in the discussion over NATO enlargement, where there is virtually no concern that an expansion motivated by fears about Russian aggression in South Central Europe will automatically, because of Sweden and Finland's Nordic location, that it will automatically significantly heighten tensions in the Arctic. There is no such consideration. I don't know that it could have been otherwise, that we could have expected American or any other Western debates about foreign policy to react more cautiously to war in Ukraine when the news and the images coming out of Ukraine are so brutal and so frightening. Such linkage, right? The effect where conflict in one region automatically spills over into another, even when there is no good reason that it should, and many good reasons why it should not. That is simply a reality of foreign policy making, a historical reality that has only grown stronger in our 21st century world of the internet, of social media, and of constant and vivid news coverage of everything everywhere. I don't have any prognosis, any prediction about the future. I don't have any recommendation on how to stop, how to counter the unraveling of Arctic cooperation and its replacement by this steady and dangerous militarization that is definitely beginning. I'm just reporting on what we see in US foreign policy debates. I'm simply observing, analyzing, and cautioning about a very dangerous phenomenon and its likely negative impact, further negative impact on Arctic cooperation for years to come. And that we simply must be cognizant of it, those of us who specialize in the Arctic, and hope that this cooperation will continue and this deterioration can be halted. This is the political reality in the United States, and I'm afraid other Western countries as well. Those of us who specialize in certain areas of environmental, scientific, commercial, or economic activity in the Arctic should step back and be aware of this larger movement that's coming and its negative consequences in the coming years. I'll stop there. I hope that wasn't too difficult for the translators, and let the other presenters speak, and then we can move to discussion. Thank you. Спасибо за внимание.
Роберт, спасибо за ваш обстоятельный доклад.
Robert, thank you very much for your report. I think it was pretty exhaustive. I would like to add something. Even before what started in February, and even before 2014, there were people talking about the Arctic as a territory of dialogue, peace, and cooperation. And at the same time, there were always people who would say that the Arctic is a territory that has some conflict potential because there is this global struggle for resources, there are territorial disputes, there are other conflict-prone situations related to military activities, for example. And then we saw some fakes in the media. We live in the post-truth world today. You mentioned something very important. You mentioned the matter of indivisible security. and you pointed out that the things happening today come as a result of irresponsible behavior by some global players in the matter of indivisible security. In addition, there are regional instability factors that had to evolve into a global crisis sooner or later. And this is what we're witnessing today. One more thing that it would be important to mention, the Ukraine crisis, like you said, it also affects global supply chains. And in the Arctic, this is primarily fish trade, and Russia plays a major role in the matter of fisheries. This affects EU countries and the UK. They depended pretty much on fish exports from Russia. The United States, not so much. It did not really rely that much, but still, there is pollock, cod, crab supplies, so it's a bit of a problem even to the United States. Okay, let's move on to soft security issues. Our next speaker is Maria Lagutina. Maria is a professor of international relations at St. Petersburg University. Maria Lagutina will talk about human security in the Arctic context. What does human security mean? And what kind of approaches do Arctic and near-Arctic states have to ensure security for people living in Arctic conditions? Maria? Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome all the colleagues, all our speakers, and our audience. I would like to ask you if you can see my slides. Yes, we see your slides. Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm always happy to speak on your platform, sharing my views. So the first thing I would like to say by way of introduction, until recently, to me, security matters in the Arctic had to do not so much with the military aspects, but I tended to focus on what you might call soft security, human security instead. No. Okay, something's wrong with my slides. Yeah, we can see your screen, your browser screen, not your slides. So you need to click on the share screen button. Open the slide. Okay, I open my slides. And now share screen, right? How about now? Yes, we can. Oh, okay, now you can see my slides. Okay, great. So let me finish the sentence. To me, when we talk about security, it's human security first and foremost. Of course, the situation we're in today is we have a very tense situation related to traditional military security matters. However, I can tell you, I don't think that the problems of human security will go away anytime soon. We may get overexcited talking about military aspects, but still, the issues of human security will not go away. we'll have to address those sooner or later. So, talking about prospects, I kind of hope that this is the area where most of the problems are of trans-border nature, are global, and the problems like climate change, no country can solve it alone, neither Russia nor anybody else. So let's just hope that things will get less emotional over time and we'll come back to proper cooperation in these matters. Okay, let me say a few words by way of introduction. People living in the Arctic had to adapt to these difficult conditions. And even though states played major roles, there have always been individuals or small communities who played a pretty important role in the Arctic, establishing this unique survival experience in harsh Arctic conditions. The 20th century was a turning point in developing the Arctic. First of all, of course, I'm talking about the Soviet Union and its efforts in developing the Arctic, developing natural resources in the Arctic. And this is where human security problems come in. Most of these problems stem from man-made factors, economic activities, and climate change. Most Arctic countries have their human security concepts. It's not something new. These countries have been studying these matters for a number of years. Unlike Russia, unfortunately, to Russia, this is something new. We only started developing our concept recently. But then there is Canada, Norway, Sweden. Those countries were among the first to develop their human security concepts. And those countries played a key role in developing human security in the Arctic overall. So let's take a look at the Arctic strategies of those countries. You can see some of them mentioned on these slides. They published new updated versions, some in 2020, some in 2021, listing their priorities. But here's an interesting fact. The term human security is not mentioned in any of those documents. There are certain elements of human securities here and there, the way it is defined by the United Nations. Certain elements are included here and there. If we study those documents, we can see some elements. I mentioned them on the right-hand side of the slide, some of the components of human security. For most Arctic countries, economic security is the #1 priority. Sustainable use of natural resources, economic development, business interests in the Arctic, etc. #2, environmental security, climate change, proper balance between environmental factors and economic development. And #3, community security, social issues, gender equality, women's rights, young people's rights, creating jobs, innovation, etc., etc. All the other components can only be found in individual countries because of their particular situations. For example, food security is only mentioned by Canada. Personal security is mentioned by Canada and Finland. Health security is only mentioned by 4 countries. So, national Arctic strategies do pay attention to various aspects of human security, but there is no country that has a comprehensive human security concept. And these approaches are mostly based on national interests, and they're country-specific, mostly based on the interests of the state, not so much focused on the interest of the people living in the Arctic. However, if we take a look at the recent versions of the Arctic concepts, we can see that the role of human dimension is increasing, and people's interests are playing an increasingly important role in these documents. And Russia is no exception in this respect. Russia has two key documents that define our national policy in the Arctic. And if we compare these two documents, we can see this evolution there. Arctic is one of the biggest priorities for Russia today. Some of the previous speakers have mentioned why the Arctic is strategically important to Russia. But I would like to add one point to this. Sometimes people tend to forget that the Arctic is also the national border. It's our northern border. That's why Russia reinforced some of its military bases in the Arctic after a period of the 1990s when those bases were largely abandoned because Russia had many other problems, many other things happening. But then in the 2020s, Russia declared that it was back, going back. And in 2008, under President Medvedev, this document of the key elements of state policy of the Russian Federation in the Arctic for the period until 2020 was published. And then in 2020, the second document was adopted, where Arctic development became a national project for Russia. This was under Putin's presidency, and Vladimir Putin has often emphasized the importance of the Arctic. So let's go back to the 2008 document. What do we see there? The Arctic is defined as a resource base for Russia's economy. So the Arctic is purely viewed as a source of natural resources, and local authorities and local people were quite unhappy with that. Of course, we all understand where it comes from. This is based on the policies that Russia pursued at the time. Basically, this approach meant that the Arctic was limited to a periphery source of raw materials, and nobody really cared about properly developing the Arctic. This kind of approach was, you might say, even dangerous and contrary to Russia's true interest, because natural resources is not what the Arctic is all about. The Arctic is not just a bunch of natural resources. Today, official rhetoric is quite different. If we take a look at the 2020 document, today the Russian authorities talk a lot about sustainable development in the Arctic. And this is actually reflected not just in the 2020 document, but also in Russia's presidency in the Arctic Council. This new approach is more comprehensive, more responsible, more ecologically minded. And one more important point, one more new thing that we see in the Arctic national policy for the period until 2035, adopted in 2020, is the human dimension. Human dimension. In English, this means more attention should be given to making life more comfortable for people living in the Arctic. And out of 5 key goals, 2 talk about improving living conditions for people living in the Arctic, improving their living conditions and protecting their natural, traditional, historical environment. In other words, we see this progress. So, human security elements are now officially recognized and incorporated into Russia's official Arctic policy. Most of the elements of human security as defined by the UN are present in this document. However, the term itself, human security, is not used overtly. But Russia is no exception, actually, in this respect, because other countries do the same. Other Arctic countries use the same approach. Okay, now let me give you a brief list of threats to human security specific to Russia.
Many of the problems that I'm going to highlight would require international cooperation. Anyway, it would require exchange and sharing of information, at least, on different topics, on different threats. I think that really it can become the way for all of us that we will follow to sit at the negotiations table, and this is where we would find some compromising decisions. Therefore, we would be capable of getting out of the critical situation today. For the Arctic area of the Russian Federation, almost all the human threats are topical, such as economic security. Speaking about the Russian Arctic, it is, first of all, caused by the weak social policy in the 1990s, lack of infrastructure, lack of investments. This exacerbated the negative tendencies in the development of the Russia's Arctic region. We saw the outflow of the people to the more developed regions of the country. You may find more such data on the internet. As a result, we see shortage of workforce in the region, whereas most of the people are living in the western part of the Arctic zone in its biggest cities, such as the city of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Many enterprises were shut down, words were left, and as a result, we have another feature of the economic development of the Arctic area as lack of homogeneity. So there are some leaders in terms of the regions which would develop very well, and there are flanking regions. There are areas and regions which could boast huge natural resources deposits with very high living standards, and at the same time, there are regions where people live according to their customs and traditions. Food security can be characterized by potential famine, lack of access to food, or no means to buy food. For the Arctic region of the Russian Federation, this risk is quite high. Food security is one of the long-term problems, which is driven by the geographical factors, special economic vulnerability, social features. This all decreases the chances of the region to procure itself with food. Therefore, it depends very much on the imports of food from other regions of the Russian Federation. Moreover, the access to food in the Russian Arctic zone would depend on the seasonal delivery of goods. Naturally, the healthcare, security, and safety are topical. Especially it was marked by the pandemic period. In the Arctic zone, another factor which would influence people's health is the climate, which brings about different pathologies driven by climate. And at the same time, there are certain morbidities which are typical of the local residents. The workers who work in shift there would be subjected to the adverse effects of the northern climate, and therefore it is detrimental to their industrial health and to the overall health. Also, the healthcare system in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation doesn't function properly. Again, you can find more on the internet. Environmental safety and security. Well, this list of risks has a cross-border nature. Speaking about the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, probably these are the least manifested risks. Certainly, we speak about the legacy of the Soviet period of the Arctic discovery and the legacy of 1990s, when the Arctic zone was pushed to the back burner. Speak about the Soviet legacy. It is when the icebreakers fleet was built, when the military drills would be held, when whole cities would be built in the Arctic zone. It's an open secret that the Soviet and the Russian Arctic, these are the regions with a very high economic activity. Therefore, actually, the Russian Arctic zone accounts for a great deal of the hotbeds, although a lot been done to eliminate these hotbeds. But nevertheless, unfortunately, Russia is among the leaders in terms of potential risks and hazards in the Arctic area. Another thing is personal security. Another problem there, actually, fight against the nomadic way of living, when the children would be exempt from the families, lack of social adaptation, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. These things are very relevant for the Arctic territories. Very often, going to city would be associated with such problems as alcohol abuse or drug abuse. 150,000 indigenous people still are nomads, which has no legal support in the Russian Federation and is not regulated at all. Therefore, safety and security problems are there. And the overall public safety and security, what I mean, the Arctic area is home to 30 peoples, and they are living according to their traditions and customs. They are nomadic, but at the same time, the living standards there are much below the one of the average regions of the Russian Federation. The unemployment rate is 1.5 times higher. Infant mortality is quite high. The concept of mining and producing natural resources in the Soviet times was quite harmful and detrimental to the local environment. We see a lot of pollution, and major damage was done to the reindeer pastures. And reindeer, this is the main source of food for the local people. That was a brief picture of what is going on in the region, and getting back to what I started with, I do believe that in the nearest future, most of these threats that I have listed that I have highlighted will still be relevant and will require a lot of attention from the local authorities, from the federal authorities, and naturally, once we speak about the international policy, to address these problems, we will have to interact with our neighbors. Wrapping up, I must say that the people's safety and security has acquired a lot of attention in the Russian Federation. This is one of the priorities of Russia's domestic policy in the Arctic region. And this is enshrined in different documents and regulations pertinent to the Arctic zone. At the same time, we have to pay attention to the fact that there is no unified sustainable development strategy in the Arctic zone. There is no mechanism for the implementation of the sustainable development concept. All these questions would require close attention to be paid by the public authorities, by the NGOs, and this is something we have to work on. Thank you so much for your attention, and this concludes my remarks. Maria, thank you so much for this your pitch. And really, it was very detailed, very comprehensive. So I'd like to thank everyone for your contributions, and we're looking forward to the questions from our listeners. Let me add, as concerns the safety and security of a man in the Arctic region, we started addressing the individual or people's safety and security due to the work of the Russia's-Swedish joint working group, which issued the individual safety and security as a global phenomena. This was the time when the think tanks in Russia and in the West worked on that problem. And the human safety and security phenomena emerged due to the cooperation between the international experts and scientists, and then it was extrapolated onto the public level. Hence, we can make certain conclusions for ourselves. Let me proceed with our next speaker, our next stakeholder, Ruslan Gubaidullin, head of the federal project Clean Arctic. Ruslan, over to you. Can you hear us? Are you with us? Yes, Catherine. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very glad to see all of you. We have gathered to discuss safety and security in the Arctic zone, the problem which is very much acute. Let me highlight what we are dealing with. My project is dealing with the environmental security. There was a video which I would like us to watch. And that video will tell you what actually we are doing and what problems are there.
Да, ну это вот как раз, чтобы нам всем немножко взбодриться, вот такой видеоролик.
Actually, I wanted all of us to a little bit to wake up. Clean Arctic project is 2 years old, and last year about 2,200 people from Russia and from some other countries took part in our volunteer project that we do in all the 9 Arctic regions of Russia. We removed more than 9 tons of waste, and we made more than 100 expeditions, which brought together more than 3.5 thousand people who were involved in removal of the wastes. And these expeditions are rolling out. The environmental safety and security, this is a question which enjoys priority at the most top level. In August, President Putin, speaking at the Youth Environmental Summit meeting in Kamchatka, said that our future lies with the Arctic region, and Arctic region is a very vulnerable in terms of environment region. What we saw on the video, certainly this is an accumulated damage done in 1950s and 60s when the Arctic region was discovered and exploited. Environmental issues were not a priority for the country. We cannot put the blame for this pollution on the path breakers who had to develop that region. Our objective as the new generation is to clean it. All the enterprises which have been built there, all the cities which are being set up there, bear in mind the Northern Sea route and other projects which are being developed there, certainly they have to comply with the totally different environmental standards. Now we put forward an objective of reaching environmental neutrality. Despite all the political differences, we invite everyone to get engaged in our project and synchronize with other events of the Arctic Council. Sadly, there are problems and difficulties that we have to address all together. First of all, we look forward to some amendments to the legislation, removing the waste which is left over from the Soviet times. We sometimes see that it is difficult to just remove it. You have to find an owner of that waste, and it's very difficult to find one. And once you find it, it's very difficult to convince him to help us removing the waste. Second thing is more stringent legislation as to the ship owners, for instance, when removing waste from the Barents Sea shores. We have to somehow remove old barrels. But now, actually, we have to remove the plastic waste as well, which is totally modern. And for instance, once you discover a plastic yogurt cup produced in GDR in 1980s, and we'll speak about the plastics migration, which somehow was driven from Europe to the Russia's Arctic shores. And now we see lots of modern plastic wastes. Let me quote some figures that were recorded along with the biological faculty of the Moscow State University following the monitoring of the plastic pollution. 33 stations obtained very high rate, from 2 to 7 tons of plastic waste per kilometer of the Barents seashore. Well, I didn't want to speak about political issues, but really this is something that concerns all of us. As far as plastic waste is very hazardous for the sea mammals and seabirds. In the scientific literature and on the YouTube, you may find a lot of information and videos as to how sea mammals may get trapped into the plastic nets, and 80% of the waste in the Arctic zone. This is about the ropes and modern ropes and other things which are being left by the modern vessels. I'm not speaking about the Soviet legacy. Among the items that we may discover in the White Sea and the Barents Sea, we can identify the owners. The plastic actually may store the information about its previous owner. 47% of these plastic wastes are being produced in Russia, 33% in Norway, and remaining 30% are being produced in Europe, Spain, Lithuania, Latvia, etc. White Sea, and which is closer to us, and the Russia's estuaries next to that. 90% of the waste there are of Russian origin. So the Barents Sea, which has international navigation, 53% of waste are of international origin. We have a 50-mile zone, which actually sees international vessels which are running there and would get rid of the waste on the way without getting to the ports of destination. And we are ready to provide scientists and the regulators with that information. We're even ready to take you on site so that you could see that with your own eyes. The pollution of the White Sea is mainly done by the Russia's waste, whereas the Barents Sea is mainly being polluted by the international waste. Siberia is home to 35 million people, whereas the Nordic countries and the northern European countries are home to more than 400 million people. And we have to bet on the environmental consciousness of the captains of vessels which run in the Arctic zone. Certainly, we don't want to see any dirt, any pollution in the Russia's part of the Arctic zone. The cleanest seas are the East Siberian and Laptev Sea, and the most polluted sea is the Pacific, North Pacific Seas and the Barents Sea. Also, we may identify the remnants of the vessel paint. The navigation and shipping has to be responsible. A lot of plastic waste, and plastic is not being recycled sufficiently, even abroad. Therefore, we have to put that question at a macro level. The plastic which is being collected from the shores can be recycled only thermally because it has already eroded due to the sun impact. It consists, 80% of it is polypropylene or other degradable components, but as far as was subjected to the sunlight, it cannot be recycled other than thermally. So the sea transforms everything into the waste, and this is a floating waste. Everything which has not drowned stays afloat. We have some subsea drones which help us to analyze the sea bottom, and there are lots of very interesting things there. Also, polyurethane and polystyrol cannot be recycled. Polystyrol even cannot be burned. This is a very heavy pollutant. Therefore, removal of wastes is something which not only of the Russia's concern, but it has to concern our colleagues from the United States, from the Nordic countries. And actually, in the Nordic countries, people are more environmentally conscious. The question of microplastics, I will not even touch upon that. That's a very serious problem, and you can find it in the tissues of different microbodies. And not always the pollution has been done by plastics. And some of the pollution has been done by the laundry machines. And some waste done by the laundry machine is not captured by the water treatment equipment. But in the Arctic region, I think that we have to clean it, and Russia applies all the efforts, not only at the level of the government, but also it's been supported by the local residents and by the volunteers. Clean Arctic is engaged by the volunteers from more than 50 regions of the Russian Federation, and also quite recently we received the volunteers from Donetsk, from Luhansk, and Kherson. We see that we have to work in that direction. Therefore, we invite international companies. And volunteers have no nationality. These are just kind-hearted people who may go anywhere to clean the grounds. And naturally, we have all together move and progress in terms of the environmental awareness. We have to bring up people who would take care of the nature, which is very fragile. We do a lot in that area. And let me turn to our colleagues. With all these political upheavals, let's not forget that the Arctic region is the kitchen of the weather.
The Arctic and what happens in the Arctic affects the whole planet. So we should be very responsible in how we carry out maritime shipping, various other economic activities. There is no room for politics in the Arctic. There should only be cooperation, especially in environmental matters. So I really admire all people working in this volunteer platform, and I encourage everybody to sign up. Yes, the Arctic is very important to Russia. It's 30% of our territory. But there is this gap between the number of people living there and the amount of pollution, the amount of plastics that we find on our Arctic shores. It's an international problem. So like I said, I encourage everybody to join our project. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruslan. I think it touched all of our viewers. You cannot possibly remain indifferent to problems like that. You mentioned environmental education for people living in the Arctic. This is very important. We have the Barents Sea, we have the White Sea that are part of the Northern Sea route. They are part of the transport corridor that Russia plans to develop, getting other international partners involved. This will create jobs. So environmental issues should always be our top priority. But I have a question for you. Since I'm the moderator, let me ask you something. You talk about a volunteer movement, about volunteers who help clean these pollution in the Barents Sea, in the White Sea. You gave us some statistics. You showed us a very vivid picture. But let me ask you about international cooperation. Before what happened in February, we did have some joint projects. Eco-Arctic, Finland, Norway were part of it. and some Russian government agencies, some Russian research centers were also involved. But then those projects were suspended, and they're still in this suspended state. Let me ask you about our international partners, those who are interested in working together with Russia. Do you think there are any interested parties as far as water treatment projects are concerned along the Northern Sea route? Well, starting this spring, we don't see much interest from international companies as far as the volunteer movement is concerned. We do need to restructure our work, because we did have a lot of work planned in line with UN sustainable development programs, but now it is all forgotten. So I address to our colleagues in the United States and Europe, hey, where are you guys, colleagues? Are you no longer interested in these problems? Global warming, climate, protecting flora and fauna. The focus has shifted. People no longer think about climatic security. They no longer think even about food security. All these matters have been trumped by political considerations. And the world's population keeps growing. We added another 1 billion people just recently, even though only 100 years ago, the population of the planet was only 2 billion people. And these problems, they affect everybody. So this kind of approach, ignoring problems, I understand where they come from, but I don't think this is a responsible position. So I encourage everybody to come back to proper interaction, proper cooperation between scientists, between volunteers. Let's come back, let's restart this work, because plastics, oil, other kinds of pollution, things that get spilled, dumped into our rivers or dumped by ships, this affects everybody. It's an international, it's a global problem. This affects the air we breathe in. This affects chemicals in the rain that comes down on us. And waste management is a measure of civilization. So let's act like civilized countries in waste management. So I just hope we get back to where we were before the pandemic. Thanks, Ruslan. Once again, we move on to our last speaker, and we have Alexandra Middleton, international Arctic cooperation expert from Finland.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And following our colleague from the US, I will try to speak slowly so the interpreters can follow. So today I will talk about intrinsic value of Arctic scientific cooperation. Why do we have this cooperation in the first place? What is at stake? And how do we continue? Arctic regions are undergoing unprecedented changes, both environmental and socio-economic ones. The impact of climate change is the most pronounced here. We have demographic challenges, rapid urbanization, aging population, and we also have intensification of extractive industries and increased inequality, energy insecurity. These are just few challenges that are facing the Arctic. Monitoring and analysis of these trends requires large scientific base, coordination and cooperation between international researchers. These challenges are here today, and they are not going to disappear. They are here to stay. And instead, we are facing the new ones, such as plastic pollution and the loss of biodiversity in the Arctic. Growing commercial interest in the Arctic resources shall take into account vulnerability of Arctic ecosystems, and the role of scientific community is to inform, to create awareness, and to be engaged in science diplomacy. During last 20-30 years, Arctic scientific cooperation has created both tangible and intangible assets. Tangible are the institutes and organizations and fora like intergovernmental forum like Arctic Council. But intangible are the knowledge networks, relationship, and the pool of shared expertise of Arctic researchers from around the globe. These intangible networks are sometimes easy to access, like you can go to LinkedIn and find the community of Arctic researchers, but sometimes they are hidden from the outside world, and still they are built on the principles of trust and respect for scientific rigor among fellow Arctic researchers. Currently, formal cooperation channels are paused, but at the same time, the message is that collaboration between individual researchers shall continue where possible. So what we have is that the agency of the Arctic researchers becomes more pronounced, and they become the actors of change themselves. And when we ask what is at stake and why we as scientists should continue Arctic research cooperation, I would answer it this way, that as it stands, we as humanity are facing existential threat due to climate crisis. Adverse effect of unmitigated climate change could annihilate life and permanently change the Earth as we know it. Future generations do not have control over the kind of world we leave for them. And according to the philosopher Nick Bostrom, making their representation is an important moral and political priority. Apart from representation for future generations, it's important that they are given the chance to exist. And these future generations are fundamentally disempowered. They will inherit the world and society we leave behind. Yet, they have no influence on how our societies are governed. They are unable to vote. They are not considered in our legal systems. These future generations, including our children, grandchildren, and many millions of people that are yet to exist, they're all significant. However, it's not easy to represent generations that yet not exist. And in Dennis Thompson's essay from 2010, there is a claim that there is a tendency to neglect long-term environmental risks. And democracy is very partial towards present. Still, I think there is a hope and the change in the system. The UN report, Our Common Agenda, looks ahead to the next 25 years and represents vision on the future of global cooperation. Addressing risks to our planet need to be part of every decision, every policy, every investment, and every budget. existential risk reduction is beneficial for those that live today, but the incremental value of that is actually towards future generation. As a Declaration on Human Rights celebrated already 70th anniversary, there is a declaration on future generations in the making. And draft paper makes a distinction between youth and future generations. In the Elements paper, it defines future generations as all those that yet not exist, yet to come, and who will eventually inherit this planet. A recognition of the need to identify, monitor, and manage existential risk is the key to ensuring that future generations can benefit from the full range of measures that are identified in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can adopt the same thinking for the Arctic and call it our common Arctic agenda, in which we explicitly address future generations, long-termism, and also include these existential risks, and identify the role of science cooperation and what it is going to play in it. So my message is, let's engage in scenario planning. If scientific cooperation does not continue in the long perspective, how are we to address existential risk and safeguard the interest of future generations? We need an envoy for future generations in the Arctic. I believe in an intrinsic value of Arctic scientific cooperation among all countries, and we need to build up on the accumulated scientific intangible assets that we already have in the Arctic. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Александра, спасибо за
Alexandra, thank you so much
Вы затронули важные
for your
вопросы,
presentation.
связанные с
You have touched upon very important questions related to maintaining scientific contacts and educational contacts in the Arctic, and this is associated with the United Nations SDGs. And no one expected that all the contacts would be severed, but at the same time, the situation has unfolded the way that we have to live in such a situation. We have to live and further do our scientific activity, maintain our contacts at a personal level with the international researchers. But at the same time, we will take into consideration both your viewpoint and the viewpoints of your colleagues regarding our cooperation and maintaining our future contacts. Should you have any comments or propositions, anything related to the previous speeches, you're most welcome. We have several minutes and we're ready to take it. Probably you have some questions to raise. In that case, I suggest that we call it a day. That was the 4th session at which everyone would discover something new, and we will use that further in our work, in our expert work. I believe that the discussion was quite interesting, and finally, we went beyond the national borders and we extended the horizons of our knowledge and excellence. So again, dear colleagues, thank you so much for your inputs.
Спасибо, до свидания.
До свидания, дорогие друзья.